From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Take on the South loves stories, and we have one today that will take your breath away. It is a story long hidden, long anchored in silence, long hostage to doubt. The story of an enslaved woman, a writer no less, whose story tells us as much about the preeminent importance of dogged historical research as it does about the lives of the enslaved in the Old South. This is the story of Hannah Crafts. To help us tell it, we have in the studio Gregg Hecimovich, Hutchins Family Fellow at Harvard University and Professor of English at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Gregg is the author of 6 books and edited volumes, including the highly acclaimed The Life and Times of Hannah Crafts, the true story of the Bondwoman's narrative, which was published last year. Gregg received his PhD in English from Vanderbilt University and is a recipient of many fellowships, including those from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Humanities Center. His Life and Times of Hannah Crafts was selected by the Washington Post as one of the 10 best books of 2023, and I will tell you that's putting it mildly. Gregg, welcome to the program.
It's so wonderful to be here, Mark. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure entirely. This is one of the most fascinating stories, I think, that I've ever read, and I want us to share this with our listeners. This will be educative on many levels. So your terrific book, which is essentially a biography of Hannah Crafts, was a very long time in the making, and it tells a really complicated story. So for listeners who aren't familiar with her, can you tell us the origins of your involvement with the story of a woman who fled slavery, then wrote about it, and whose manuscript was lost for what, a century and a half?
That's right, yes. So I got involved in 2002 when Henry Louis Gates Jr. published The Bondwoman's Narrative. It became a New York Times bestseller. Mm-hmm. He authenticated the work and gestured to what the circumstantial evidence seemed to prove, that it was written by a formerly enslaved woman. He could not identify the specific historical person, but it was compelling, the work that he and forensic scientists did to authenticate the work as written by somebody who escaped slavery, probably from the possession of a man named John Hill Wheeler, a very prominent North Carolinian and politician. I got involved because I'd happened to move to Eastern North Carolina in 2002, shortly after this book became a bestseller. I read it and I was entranced. And then, just as good fortune would happen, Dr. Gates had a graduate student at the time, Hollis Robbins, who had discovered that the work that was already circulating as a bestseller borrowed, in very fascinating ways, passages of Charles Dickens' Bleak House. She couldn't do the research herself. She couldn't come down to an obscure archive in Eastern North Carolina, and she contacted me and asked me to dig in to records following a lead of hers that perhaps the author came from John Hill Wheeler's brother's family. His name was Samuel Jordan Wheeler. I took that quest up for her, and this is what's so great, collaborative scholars. I worked for years going into communities, descendant communities, interviewing people, gathering family papers from their attics. They would invite me over for tea, and then go up and come down with family trees, and just slowly piecing the story together. A year or two into this, Dr. Gates and Dr. Robbins, who are dear, dear friends, have worked with me closely for the 20 years to complete this story. They told me, you take on this work yourself now. You are there, you've discovered this is your story. And they just supported me all along for the next 20 years. And so that was the origin of my participation.
So there you are. You're in the English department at East Carolina University. You're Associate Dean.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. And, you're doing your regular work, your Victorian English stuff, right? which I like a great deal, naturally. But you're also deeply involved in the kind of interrogation of the past around you, right? So you're talking to people and you say, hey, what letters do you have? And it's almost happenstance, isn't it? I mean, this you get this inquiry, and you've got a sensibility about you that, from reading this, it seems that you can't say no to a nutty, difficult historical problem, right? You have a deep curiosity about history.
Yes, for sure. And it found me, like the story. I was in Eastern North Carolina, and what had always brought me into the study, into academic study, was the power of history. Now, in literary studies, I would write the historical backgrounds and how it would shape works by Dickens or Hardy or Austen. But I had, with this opportunity, every single day I moved in the world of Eastern North Carolina, the names on the streets, the ways, the tire shop named after the Pugh family, I would go out into the community of Bertie and understand and begin digging into who this family was. Right. Their names are everywhere, but that deeper history. So before it was kind of an academic exercise for me. I would go to the British Library and piece together the scholarship that I would do, but it was living history and living kind of in the laboratory of the archival work that you're doing. So as a scholar, that was just incredibly exciting to trace. But it all started for me with the descendant communities. So I want to name. So I would go to Windsor, North Carolina on a Friday night and arrange a talk at the community center. Nothing else is going on in Windsor on a Friday night. The community turns out. And when I give a talk, I don't go in there like I have the answers. I remember the first night I was there, I pronounced the county's name wrong. Everybody in the audience erupted. It's Bertie.
Welcome to my world. I understand this thing too well.
So these descendant communities were the ones who preserved the story and then shared it with me to allow me to discover. And that includes Albert Bishop, Walter Cray, Marva Dixon, Kalisa Hickerson, Joanna Reed, Alvin Smallwood, Benjamin Speller, Isabel Stewart, and Wendell White. These are all people from that community who generously shared their time, their history, and helped me with the detective work over all those years to discover the author.
So the nut of the problem. So Professor Gates publishes this book in 2001, and as you say, they've gone through a fairly detailed forensic analysis in an effort to authenticate authorship. I mean, didn't they analyze the paper and the writing and all sorts of things that have brought science to bear?
Yes.
But the truth is, Gregg, it wasn't enough, was it?
No.
Because there are doubters.
Yes, there were serious doubters, but the foundational work was extraordinary. And this is the interdisciplinary story. And this is where I want to credit, people like Dr. Gates, Dr. Robbins. In the humanities, we have this idea that we go into a cell and we produce a monograph as though it springs from your head. And that's not how it always works, but there is a model of that. In the sciences, it's in a laboratory with students, and people are cycling through and asking big questions. Sometimes in the humanities, it's the same way, and this project was that way. So Dr. Gates brings to bear all his own genius, his connections, his wonderful forensic scientist, and then he's teaching the graduate students. And he and Dr. Robbins put together an edited collection of essays. They draw on all these wonderful people who bring their different perspectives to understanding the novel and its potential authenticity as written by an enslaved woman. And when he does that collection, he invites skeptics in. So that collection includes people historians, a very important historian from Eastern North Carolina who just said this is not written by a black woman, and that was Thomas Paramore. And if you're going to reckon with the document, you have to reckon with the skeptics. And he brought that, and frankly, Dr. Paramore's work was essential. Knocking down his critique was essential to finding the author.
This is the beautiful dialectic of research. That's how it's supposed to work. But there's a lot at stake here, right? I mean, especially when it comes to what are called slave narratives.
Yes.
I mean, in the 19th century, the doubt was politicized. I mean, they had to doubt that somebody could write this, that there hadn't been a white hand involved. And in a way, the politics of slavery silenced those voices. So there's a lot at stake here.
Yes.
When you take this project on, authenticity is key. So
Yeah.
even after all the forensic stuff,
Right.
there's still that last bit left. And that last bit left is a long bridge.
Yes.
So there you are, and hang on a minute, I'm trying to find, and this is an historical project, not a project of physics or science. This
Yeah.
is the historian in the archive,
Yes.
multiple archives, public and private.
Yes.
What happens? How do you, I mean, I'm sure there was not one aha moment.
Right.
Because how many years did this take you?
Yeah. Well, to discover the author
Yeah.
was 11 years.
11 years.
And then to piece together the full story the way that I did was another 9.
So you just went
through
in
editing.
determined, tenacious, dogged, you're picking up stuff. What was the bit that led you to say, hang on a minute, this Hannah Crafts did in fact write this? It's Hannah Bond, but
Yeah. Well, hugely important was, I always describe it as a series of Chinese lanterns.
Okay.
Like, you make a discovery, another discovery comes down the line. I'll give you an example. So, and this is going to seem small, but this is right there at the beginning. I go down to Margaret Worthington's home in Wilmington, North Carolina. She's a descendant of the family I'm focused on, the Wheeler family.
Okay.
She has papers that no one else has that have been descended. Her father was an amateur historian who kept notebooks about the property records of the family. Nobody knows this. She shares that with me. And at one point in that time that I spent with her, there were these almanacs, these old almanac books. And I said, why are these important to look at? She's like, you really want to look at those, because he kept mini diaries in the pages of that almanac. And those almanacs allow me to get a sense of the daily life, right? To begin to see where the enslaved people, such as Hannah Bond, were and how they lived. That also sent me back to the Library of Congress, because John Hill Wheeler, who we knew Gates had identified as the person that Hannah Bond escaped from, his records are there, and he has a miscellaneous file that has his almanacs that nobody looked in. And in there were records of how he and his brother fought against Nat Turner during the Nat Turner's Rebellion. It's a chapter in the book. And it also had a list of enslaved people's names and their ages. So I was able to begin building the family stories of the enslaved people connected, all because so that was one light. Later on, another lamp goes on, and I'm doing obscure research in Wentworth, North Carolina, in a small archive, because I'm looking at the forensic evidence of the paper. The paper that's used to write the novel has a particular watermark, a particular embossment, and the way paper was produced. And I'm very interested, because everything's pointing to the author having written it in 1856, 1857. Well, I discovered letters that are coming outside the Wheeler household on the same paper with the same forensic marks as the paper that the novel's written on. Another lamp goes off. So it was this series of slowly piecing the story to get back to this history of slavery. This history was, like, if you went by official channels, the Wheeler family claimed that they manumitted all their slaves and sent them to Liberia. This is the story they tell at Wheeler House in Murfreesboro, North Carolina. This is the story Paramore gestures towards in his own research, and he helped recreate the physical Wheeler House. But down in the archives in Texas is an obscure manifest of their sale of 18 enslaved men, women, and children in 1836. And their names, colors, and ages are there. So this history that was completely erased, if you walked into Murfreesboro, North Carolina, you wouldn't know anything about any of these people. This novel that Gates helped discover, and there's a story behind that, which I'm happy to share later, but this novel that he discovered and brought back to the surface had this powerful history that Americans willfully tried to erase. The way archival records are maintained, attempted to just completely delete. But that couldn't happen. The imaginative work of this woman who wrote this compelling novel, and we definitely need to talk about the novel, kept those stories alive. It's what a writer does, an artist does. She preserves the vitality of the world that she's living in through her imaginative art. And that's what she did with that novel. And the rescue of that by Gates, by the scholars that collaborate, by the forensic scientists, by the descendant communities who knew enough of that history to help piece together the whole story, that I just work as a kind of executive producer putting those pieces and those scenes together.
Let's talk about what this novel says, but just quickly, I'm just curious, how many miles do you think you've logged doing all of this?
Yeah, it's a ton of miles, and a lot of times it's on your own nickel. Like I would fly up to New York. It does take a long time, right, and a lot of miles, because there's not one place you go to get the story, so you have to travel.
This is a sobering reminder for any graduate students or undergraduate students doing research. I think that everything's available on the internet, and like 99% of it is not available on the internet. You've got to really dig into very small archives that you've never heard of. But places do retain their history. They just squirrel them away different places.
Even that electronic world can make you think that it's not there because it's been misindexed. Right. So that Wheeler Manifest of those slaves that are, you can Google it in Ancestry and you're going to get a completely different name because it's mistranscribed by the people that were entering the data records. You got to go look at the record.
That's right. Yeah, this is details. Details matter, right?
Yes.
Tenacity matters. All right, tell us the story that Hannah Crafts tells.
Certainly. So Hannah Crafts tells this powerful story of an enslaved woman who is the autobiographical narrator of her text. And she calls her protagonist Hannah after herself. Her mother was also named Hannah. And she had experienced the sexual assault that was hugely a part of enslaved life. And this is a very difficult story to tell, but it's one she managed in her novel. So in her novel, she frames it this way. It's not like today where people can write memoirs about deeply difficult trauma, right? That was not available in the 19th century. If you look at Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, she's doing the same thing. She's narrativizing a trauma and in some ways working through that trauma and writing that narrative. Hannah Bond does the same thing in the novel. So the novel centers around this passing woman who is perceived to be white but is in fact black. That is exactly what her experience was. She was sexually trafficked to a nephew of her enslaver, who was probably her father, who she was probably born of rape from Louis Bond, her father. She was trafficked to Thomas Bond Jr. in the 1840s after her mother was sent away right before teenage years. Which, this is all terrible. It's also authenticated in family records of descendant community right on the plantation right next door to the one she grew up in. So the story matches what she's telling in her autobiographical novel. So in the novel, she tells the story of this trafficking, but she disguises it in this mystery of an unnamed enslaver who is discovers the racial identity of his passing daughter. The passing daughter dies, and then the story reverts back to the main protagonist, Hannah. What she's doing there is telling her story of sexual trauma. And what the historical record bears is that that trauma, there's a notation in a slave inventory of Hannah and child that we can see that Hannah, in fact, did have a child. That child passed through disease that ravaged the same area. There are other deaths in the family. We can kind of trace where that vector's from. And then she moved on. That's all disguised in the novel. The novel isn't about her victimhood. The novel is about the triumph of Hannah in the book. So Hannah in the book she maintains her psychic wholeness. She's not, if you read the book, there isn't a scene where the protagonist is sexually abused and somehow damaged by that abuse. That is pawned off on the passing mistress, which is a narrative device, and then she triumphs over that. And so what happens in the book is she creates her own art out of this trauma. I'll give you a quick example. Hannah Crafts, we know, as Hannah Bond at the time, living the Wheeler family, was forced to go to blackface minstrel performances. The Wheelers loved these things. She was forced to watch white people blacken their face and there was a particular scene that I was able to trace, do a sort of play on Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I was able to identify a specific performance she was at where she watched white people blacken their faces, pretend they're in Canada, and claim they wish they were back in slavery. The white audience, the newspapers, people loved this. She thought it was crazy. When she writes her novel, she tells the story of Mrs. Wheeler. She puts, Hannah in the novel, puts whitening powder on Mrs. Wheeler's face as she's about to beg for a government appointment for her husband. This is all based on autobiographical truth. And then she imagines this. She passes a smelling bottle under Mrs. Wheeler's face. Her face turns black and she has no idea that her face is black. She goes and begs in blackface in front of other white people for an appointment and then comes home. It's the show-stopping scene of the novel. But what she's doing is she sees what white people are doing with their minstrel performances, and she flips the scripts as an artist who creates this powerful novel that tells the life of enslavement, but the beauty, the inventiveness, and the humor of people who are being robbed of a voice. Yeah. And this is just extraordinary. She's looking forward to what Toni Morrison's going to do, what Jesmyn Ward does, what the brilliance of African American art does. She's right there on the ground floor producing it. And I want to add one more thing. What we have with her is a holograph manuscript. We don't have this for Frederick Douglass. We have this for almost no other early writers. So we can see in the manuscript her own work, right? The way she wanted to present it. She didn't have a white abolitionist editor averring to all of her work. So she had the liberty to tell like a novelist would, right? So she didn't just write, I'm going to tell you the facts. She's going to write an autobiographical novel that embroiders her own artistic vision onto the experiences of slavery. And it's not written because she has to prove it to an abolitionist society. She's writing it for herself.
That was actually a really nice summary of a lot of complex things. This is not a small manuscript either, just over 300 pages.
Yes, yeah. 312.
So it's substantial.
Yes, quite.
And she escapes from the plantation in, 1857?
1857, yes, May.
And how does she escape?
She escapes because she dresses herself in male attire. And this is something that also came from family papers. There is a nephew that is in the same household where she served the Wheelers. His name was also John Wheeler, but we'll call him Young John. This young man, in his letters that were maintained by family members who passed it on to me in Windsor, North Carolina, he is the only Wheeler family member who writes in every letter, "Remember me to the servants." And then, because I knew that there was some record of his life, he died early in the Civil War, but the family mourned him. He was a brilliant person that everyone seemed to love. His school records still exist at Columbia College, which is now George Washington University. I went up there and looked into the early literary societies where they have a record of the books that they check out. Oh. And he is checking out books both pro-slavery and anti-slavery. So it's conjecture, right? Circumstantial conjecture, but he likely was the one who assisted because he was with Hannah right before her escape and when she escaped. And there's even a record of clothing that he bought, male attire, months before her escape.
Where did you find that?
That is in their diaries, in the account books of John Hill Wheeler. He lent nephew John Wheeler the money. So, it's a circumstantial gesture, and when you're writing, you can't say this is a certain truth, but circumstances suggest that this could have been the way. So that was one part of the story. The other huge part of understanding her escape is when she was in Washington, D.C., she was able to be a congregant at the first colored Baptist church, an all-black church that has a rich history that historians really haven't dug much into. Jane Johnson, who escaped also from the Wheeler family, was a part of that congregation. Paul Jennings, who was an underground operator. So there was an underground railroad network that operated out of that church that is verifiable in the historical record. So what Hannah Crafts escaped from when she was demoted, just as she is in the autobiographical novel, she was demoted to the Wheeler slave huts in North Carolina. She escaped north through Washington, D.C., used her connections of the Underground Railroad to go to upstate New York and eventually settle. All the people working on this network also had connections in Burlington, New Jersey. That's where she ended up going.
So she ends up there and
Yes.
she dies, 1905?
Yes, 1905.
Some people listening to this might be a bit surprised that an enslaved woman knew how to write.
Yes.
Which, of course, that's the whole point of slavery. It's perpetual and forced ignorance, right? Yes. How did Hannah learn to write?
She learned to write. She narrates this, as many slave narratives do. She narrates this through her autobiographical novel. A Quaker family that lived close by in Indian Woods likely were the ones who helped teach reading to her. Then she had, and this is verifiable, the Wheeler family, this was different than many families, but there was a free-floating literacy that was accepted, especially within some families. The Wheeler family, we have records of other enslaved people who were a part of that family who had literacy. And so Hannah Craft's literacy was in some ways encouraged. Even in her autobiographical novels, she takes dictation from Mrs. Wheeler. So that literacy is acceptable. And really key to this research behind her novel is between 1852 and 1856, she served at the Wheeler House in Murfreesboro, where six or so college women boarded that she served. They were attending Chowan Baptist Female Institute, an early women's college that was right across the street, that had a circulating library. They had a literary society that met at the Wheeler House, and one of the works that they studied, we have the records of the young schoolgirls who were in that household, was Charles Dickens' Bleak House. Works that she riffs off of in her novel are there in her reachable environment. And so, like I told the earlier story about what she did with the blackface, right? The minstrels, anything that was reachable, she made her own, right? It's this beautiful testament to the power of literary art as it descends. And there's a white character in Charles Dickens' Bleak House called Esther Summerson. Contemporary readers find her to be a little too angelic, right? But she was, in Dickens' novel, somebody born from an unspeakable, sinful sexual relation. So a child born not exactly like Hannah, but but who is spurned in that novel because of her unknown parenthood. This is exactly who, when Hannah Crafts engaged that novel, she would have identified with Esther Summerson, and it helped her find her voice as a novelist to follow what she was able to glean from Dickens. So we know Frederick Douglass did these amazing things with the Columbia Orator, the first book that he held, and he could become a great orator just out of his own genius, working closely with the text. Hannah Bond and later Hannah Crafts did the same thing with that first work that is so important to her novel, which is Charles Dickens' Bleak House. And it was there in Wheeler House where she encountered it.
So this is a powerful testimony to that genius, because it's difficult. I mean, she worked hard and she obviously was gifted.
No doubt.
No doubt about it. All right. Let's switch tacks just briefly, because I'm really interested in how unusual this kind of work is. And without getting too much into the weeds of academic life, it seems to me that very few people are positioned to undertake the kind of forensic sleuthing as an historian, and then the literary reading of the novel, because you're detecting all of these genres and references. In your estimation, Gregg, this is quite rare. Would that be a fair?
I think the way in which works of research are often produced are on a quicker time frame, and you can't do this particular type of research on a short time frame. So if you're, as a scholar, if you're building your career, right, you don't take on a work that you don't even know if it's going to work out. You don't even know if you're going to discover anything, even though you're traveling all over. That this wouldn't be the project that you would pursue.
But you had tenure.
But yes. But while I was writing this, I wrote other books. Right.
You did other things. Right.
I did other things. But it doesn't. I do want to say, like, we're in this age of discovery of the African American past.
Mm-hmm.
This past summer, I led a NEH seminar on discovering the Black Archive with wonderful scholars at Clemson. We brought all these great African American young scholars together to think about, how do we do this work? Like, we all know about the silence of the archive, but there's so much silence that's not out there, and we don't need to enforce it upon ourselves. We just need to go and listen better, listen in different communities better than we have as scholars, and there's so much more to discover.
Yeah. So here we are in the Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina, and our signature is we're interdisciplinary. So we bring in together, Matt's in English, I'm in history, we have people in public health, people in music. The whole point of interdisciplinarity is to break down these kind of research silos, and it seems to me that this magnificent achievement is a function really of your commitment to interdisciplinarity. Would that be a fair characterization?
Completely. And it's a willingness to range outside of a specific training, taking the tools that you have outside. I was thinking about this earlier last night when I was talking with some folks at a book talk on handicrafts, and some of this is biography. So a biographer like Jonathan Igg, he writes a biography of Muhammad Ali. That doesn't mean like his whole career is in that world of Ali. He goes after Martin Luther King, right? Right. So there's, and that biography is necessarily interdisciplinary. And I think there's a vitality to what you can do when you're reaching across disciplines, and again, you're collaborating with other generous scholars, and you're learning from the forensic scientists. You're learning from experts in food history. You're learning from archaeologists. I used archaeological reports in this. Like when you're digging into many disciplines, that's not dilettantism. That's just a more thorough type of engagement, but that takes time. And the way disciplines are arranged and the reward systems aren't always built on that.
The way that research universities are structured in this country probably doesn't really promote that kind of interdisciplinarity, and that's a shame because
it's no surprise. I've never been at a Research One institution. I've been at schools that were not that were really teaching focused, where they didn't care whether I was publishing or not.
Right.
So I could take my time.
Yeah, it works out. There is something to take away from the nature and structure of higher education from this project, I think. As I read it, I thought to myself, this is either something that would have been done a long time ago or quite recently. But the way that higher education works, both here and abroad, it specializes. It doesn't give you the time to do this kind of in-depth analysis, this in-depth research. It's often extremely narrow, right?
Yeah.
This is ecumenical. You're all over the place, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And you could only do this because you are all over the place. Right?
But I want to offer hope. So what really aided me was there are entities out there that invite, fund, and support this work. So I'm in my second year at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, where an interdisciplinary coterie of scholars from all over the world come together with very different projects and collaborate and learn from each other. I've been there 2 years, funded to do that, to work on this project and another project. I've been 2 years at the National Humanities Center, where we get 30-some scholars from all over collaborating for a year. I couldn't do that work within my institutions. I couldn't collaborate across disciplines because of the pace and the focus and really difficult labor of academic life. But there are places out there like your place here, and what the sort of free-floating centers that do encourage and rechannel what can be done by focusing on interdisciplinary research. So there's also a funding that I got from the National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Fund. These things are essential to somebody who's going to take a different path, but that path can be taken. There is a strong interdisciplinary vision for the humanities that is out there by places like the Hutchins Center and also the National Humanities Center.
And shout out to Holly Crocker and the Humanities Collaborative here. That's why you're here. And this is a good illustration of that kind of interdisciplinarity at work, isn't it?
That's right. And last night I'm at dinner with Holly Crocker, Tom Leakin, and Nikki Finney. And my God, you bring 3 brilliant people from different fields together. And it was just a scintillating evening of thinking about public scholarship.
We could go on for ages and ages about this, Gregg. Let me wrap up by asking you 2 questions. What happens to Hannah Bond in the late 19th century? What does she do?
So she ends up, this is a beautiful story, and it was a joy to discover this. She ends up in Burlington, New Jersey. She marries a man named Thomas Vincent. She's a very religious woman, and that religion and the community that she found first at the first Black Baptist church that she was a part of in Washington, D.C., she reconnects with the church community in Burlington, the Burlington AME Church, where her husband was also was a pastor. She teaches school in an all-black school close to there, and encourages the next generation of Black young men and young children literacy. She teaches them how to gain the gifts that she had to struggle to have for herself. She lives into old age with a stepson. This is what I love, Mark. She lost her mother when she was 10 years old, and it's the deepest wound that's a part of her story in her novel. When she marries, she receives into her life a stepson who's 8 years old. She becomes a mother to him, and at her death, that stepson's with her.
Wow, that's poignant. What's next for you? What are you doing?
So I have a new project that I've worked on already for 8 years that's focused here in Columbia, South Carolina. I published some on it, and it's doing similar work. It's an ensemble biography of 7 enslaved men and women who were photographed in Columbia, South Carolina in March 1850. They were stripped naked and forced before the lens of Joseph T. Zealy. These photographs were discovered in 1976 in an attic at the Peabody Museum up in Cambridge. I've been working with scholars, same story, collaboration, interdisciplinary. It's going to take a long time to tell the whole story, but I'm recovering through descendant communities the life stories and the legacies of those 7 people.
I don't think that story could be in better hands. Gregg, thanks for being on Take on the South.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. This was a joy.
My pleasure. That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.